Quantum leaders, the strategist, oscillation between strong and weak forces. The strategist's natural style is logical, structured, and methodical, rooted in precision and purpose. But when viewed through the quantum principle of oscillation between strong and weak forces, their planning genius becomes far more dynamic. The strong force appears in their structured blueprints, step-by-step clarity, and confident execution. The weak force shows up in their adaptability, quiet recalibration, and sensitivity to invisible variables. Their mastery lies in their ability to oscillate between firm design and subtle course correction, making their plans not just strategic, but alive. With a motivation direction of towards, the strategist constantly designs forward. They're drawn toward accomplishment, implementation, and measurable success. The strong force compels them to move with clarity and decisiveness. Yet the weak force whispers when timelines must shift, when the emotional tone of a project needs softening, or when recalibration matters more than momentum. Strategists lead best when they alternate between driving forward and quietly tuning their compass. Their attention focus on self gives them a strong internal reference for excellence. The strong force here is their ability to uphold their own standards, to move regardless of outside noise. But the weak force shows when they allow external dynamics, market shifts, or emotional undercurrents to soften and inform their decisions, not to compromise, but to refine. Oscillating between inner conviction and outer feedback creates true mastery. The internal frame of reference that defines the strategist makes them trustworthy decision makers. They trust their logic, principles, and systems. The strong force allows them to remain unmoved by temporary chaos. Yet, when the weak force is honored, they access pre-rational sensing, intuitive clarity, and nonlinear insight. A true strategist knows when to lean into analysis and when to let the deeper current of knowing guide unseen patterns. With a procedural operational style, the strategist brings order from complexity. Strong force manifests in their adherence to structured methodologies. Yet too much procedural reliance creates rigidity. The weak force invites pauses, pivots, and spontaneous redesign. Great strategists are not mechanical. They are rhythmic. They know that procedures are not cages, but tools to be adjusted when conditions evolve. Their general viewpoint lets them design at scale, considering outcomes, systems, and long arcs. The strong force leads them to architect enduring solutions. The weak force lets them respond to subtle shifts in culture, team morale, or unseen resistance. Oscillating between overarching clarity and gentle responsiveness makes their strategic vision not only clear, but regenerative. A solo work preference allows strategists to think deeply and act with precision. The strong force shows up in their independence, their ability to operate without distraction. The weak force, however, reveals itself in their receptivity to collaboration, the willingness to gather insights from trusted others, and the capacity to emerge from solitude to engage synergy. Moving between isolation and inclusion builds their wisdom reservoir. Their associated emotional engagement means they're personally invested in their strategies and outcomes. They care deeply about the structures they design. But if the strong emotional charge is never balanced with emotional neutrality, the weak force, burnout or attachment may follow. The strategist must learn to shift between full investment and brief, strategic detachment, so they can adjust, release, or rework without emotional residue. A matcher approach style means the strategist builds from what already works. The strong force draws on precedent, past success, and time-tested frameworks. The weak force, however, pushes them toward incremental innovation, quietly shifting parameters, layering insight, and nudging systems forward. This dance between stability and subtle evolution ensures their strategies don't stagnate. Their through-time orientation means they think in sequences, forecasts, and logical progression. The strong force empowers them to walk a timeline step by step. The weak force appears when they intuit timing shifts, when they sense that pausing or skipping a step may better serve the flow. Master strategists blend plan and pattern, calendar, and kairos. And with a primary drive of activity, they build through doing. Yet the most powerful doing arises when it's balanced with intentional not doing, spaces of stillness where unseen forces organize the next best move. In this rhythm, between decisive action and conscious receptivity, the strategist transcends plans and becomes a conductor of transformation. Quantum leaders, the strategist, dynamic equilibrium as nature's core design. The strategist's natural style of structured thinking and logical planning thrives when it finds its center within dynamic equilibrium. While they naturally design step-by-step frameworks, this principle teaches that even the most robust plan must live within an adaptable system. The strategist's power increases when structure meets flow, when they stabilize without becoming static. Dynamic equilibrium empowers them to build systems that flex under pressure but do not fracture, to guide processes that remain stable while evolving. With a motivation direction of towards, the strategist is compelled to reach specific, well-mapped outcomes. But dynamic equilibrium reminds them that the path to a goal is never entirely linear. Their forward drive must be balanced with inner patience, emotional pacing, and the capacity to pivot without losing clarity. Instead of racing to the endpoint, they develop a tempo, a rhythm between strategic movement and stabilizing reflection. Their attention focus on self grants them precision and discipline. However, dynamic equilibrium requires that they regularly rebalance this internal orientation with external awareness. Their planning becomes stronger when it accounts for both their personal standards and the shifting needs of others. The self becomes the axis, not a silo, from which balance is maintained amid changing conditions. An internal frame of reference allows strategists to rely on their own logical assessments. The strong force here is unwavering decisiveness. Yet this must harmonize with the weak force of openness, the ability to pause and receive unexpected feedback, intuitive nudges, and subtle shifts in context. In balance, their decisions no longer operate in vacuum, but flow in real-time alignment with complexity. With a procedural operational style, the strategist brings a sense of order, but dynamic equilibrium invites them to see procedures not as fixed rituals, but as living processes that evolve. Their procedures must breathe, flexing slightly in response to situational tension while still holding form. This capacity for both constancy and calibration is what makes their structures enduring rather than brittle. Their general viewpoint gives them the ability to plan across systems and outcomes. Equilibrium teaches that general planning must include polarity, where ambition is counterweighted by sustainability, and where projected timelines are re-examined in light of new information. Strategists at equilibrium measure success not only by what is completed, but by what remains aligned throughout the process. In a solo work preference, they value focus and autonomy. Yet, equilibrium is achieved when solitude is balanced with intentional relational exchange. Brief infusions of collaborative perspective prevent echo chambers. Their ideas grow stronger not when diluted, but when tested through compatible counterpoint. The strategist expands without losing self when they oscillate between execution and consultation. Their associated emotional engagement means they are personally woven into their plans. However, equilibrium invites emotional regulation. This doesn't mean suppressing feeling, it means stabilizing passion with presence, urgency with attunement. They learn to hold emotional investment as a steady current, not as waves of intensity that risk burnout or rigidity. As a matcher, the strategist depends on what's worked before. The strong force here is reliability. But equilibrium introduces evolutionary pressure. Even what worked once may require refinement. The strategist who balances legacy systems with adaptive feedback creates living blueprints. They don't discard tradition, but they don't idolize it either. Their through-time orientation equips them with long-term vision. But equilibrium ensures they balance foresight with responsiveness to the present. Strategic timelines thrive when anchored in fluidity. Equilibrium allows for real-time calibration without derailing the broader arc. And with a primary drive of activity, the strategist builds momentum through doing. But in dynamic equilibrium, doing is no longer compulsive. It becomes precise, paced, and self-renewing. Their action becomes an instrument of systemic stability, not just output. They shift from merely managing time to composing its rhythm. Quantum leaders, the strategist, observer effect, and the collapse of possibility. The strategist's natural style, methodical and structured, interacts powerfully with the observer effect, the quantum principle that observing a potential reality begins to collapse it into form. As a planner, the strategist often defines what success will look like. But in quantum terms, their structured vision acts as more than a prediction. It's an act of crystallization. The moment they begin planning, they narrow infinite possibilities into a pathway of growing probability. Their attention doesn't just track movement, it initiates it. With a motivation direction of towards, the strategist looks ahead with deliberate precision. Yet through the lens of the observer effect, every timeline they fix their gaze upon gains weight and form. The clarity of their goals accelerates manifestation. However, if their observation is too rigid or attached, they may collapse suboptimal outcomes. The master strategist balances defined attention with space for the unknown, witnessing the future without prematurely closing its possibilities. Their attention focus on self gives them control over where their observation lands. Their inner standards shape the metrics of success. When they observe themselves executing with clarity, they stabilize the system from within. But if they fixate on failure or anticipated disruption, they risk collapsing those realities through subtle negative expectation. Self-observation must be disciplined, neutral, and future-facing. With an internal frame of reference, the strategist trusts their own evaluations. But under this principle, they must recognize that their internal conclusions are not passive, they are creative acts. Each internal certainty becomes an organizing signal to the external system. To wield this well, the strategist must observe their own beliefs, filtering for assumptions that may unknowingly reinforce limits. A procedural operational style reveals how the strategist collapses abstract vision into real-world execution. Every step chosen signals a commitment to a particular outcome. But if procedures become too fixed too early, they may suppress better emergent paths. The strategist's task is to use procedures as scaffolding, not prisons, to observe the plan while allowing room for probabilistic flux. Their general viewpoint allows them to set context, define objectives, and assess long-term probabilities. But the observer effect introduces humility. What they focus on becomes dominant. The strategist's framework must remain responsive. If they over-observe one pattern or risk, they may inadvertently lock it in. Reality conforms to repeated focus. Therefore, they must practice rotating observation, gently scanning wider fields of possibility. A solo work preference makes them the primary observer in their system. This is both power and responsibility. When working alone, the strategist's internal narratives gain disproportionate weight. They must become skilled in watching their own mind, tracking what they feed with attention and what they allow to fade. Their isolation must be intentional, not incubating limiting conclusions. Their associated emotional engagement adds charge to their observations. When they invest emotionally in a strategy, they amplify its quantum presence. This is powerful, so long as the emotion is congruent with the outcome they desire. If fear, doubt, or resentment enter the field, they begin energizing undesired timelines. Emotional mastery becomes a core leadership act, not to suppress emotion, but to align it with intention. As a matcher, the strategist looks for repetition and patterns. This habit shapes which realities they collapse. What has occurred before becomes a model for what will be. But the observer effect invites them to shift from mimicry to authorship. Rather than reproducing what worked, they can choose to observe from possibility rather than from precedent. Vision replaces prediction. With a through-time orientation, the strategist visualizes outcomes and constructs sequencing. Each observation made across this timeline becomes a magnet pulling reality forward. But this also cautions them to avoid overdefining each phase. Flexibility in observation allows the system to breathe. Their timelines must serve as rivers, not rails. And their primary drive, activity, means they engage reality through execution. But now every action becomes an observation made physical. They are not merely executing strategy, they are observing with their entire body. Every decision, step, and movement is an energetic choice to bring one outcome into form over infinite others. The strategist, therefore, must learn to act with clarity, observe with responsibility, and lead with awareness of their own immense influence.